Hey everybody, welcome to episode 2 of the Alex Merced Coder YouTube podcast thing. Okay, so that means, as far as I know at the moment, this whole YouTube podcast thing really just means it's a playlist that's treated special. But I'm going with it. Okay, so bottom line is this. In the previous video, we just kind of introduced like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and kind of what their role is and how to use Visual Studio Code and open up a web page in the browser using the live server extension on Visual Studio Code. Now in this video, what I want to do is just talk a little bit more about that whole idea of different types of HTML elements and just kind of understanding their default behaviors. Okay. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go open up this index.html. I'm going to actually create a different HTML. Let's call this new file. We'll call it elements.html. And I'm going to open this up in live server. So by right clicking and opening it up, see it opens it up right there. How nice is that? Okay. And a cool thing that's built into Visual Studio Code is a tool called Emmet. What Emmet does is that it gives you shortcuts for writing HTML. So essentially I could do something like this, write exclamation point, and see this is an Emmet abbreviation. And what this does is sets up all that boilerplate HTML. So there it is, my standard HTML boilerplate. So that way you don't have to write out all those tags yourself. And then I can get just started just writing what's inside of the body. So as we mentioned, there's different types of block elements. So as I mentioned, there's different types of headings. Okay. So, so we'll say, hey, there's an H1. Okay, and we'll say this is an H1. And H2. This is an H2, although I'm not seeing it appear over here, so let's update this. Yep, there we go. So you see H2. So you see each heading is smaller. So if I keep doing this all the way up to H6, so H3, H4, H5, and H6. Okay, so a couple things to notice. One, the certain HTML elements have default styling. So you can see that there's some element of default styling here as far as like the font size goes. Okay, in H6, each heading gets subsequently smaller. The other thing to notice is that these are block elements, meaning it does create a block. How do we know that? They're stacking on top of each other. So if I were to open up DevTools, which simplest way to do it regardless of your operating systems, you can right click, then click this inspect button. Okay, if I were to go here, open up the body, and then I highlight each one. So you see each one takes up a full row. Okay, so those are all block elements. Okay, if I were to change them to inline elements, because you can change how an element, any default behavior of an element. So if I were to open up a style tag here, and I want to style all of these things to be inline elements so you can see the difference, I can just say, hey, H1, H2, H3. So I'm targeting all of these, H4, H5, H6. So you see the comma allows me to separate different things that I'm targeting. Okay, so I'm targeting all of these things, and I'm going to change their display property. So by default, the H1's display property is block, meaning it's treated as a block element, so they stack on top of each other in rows. But if I change it to inline, watch what happens. See, now they're all on the same row because they're now inline elements. So you see the difference in the behavior between something that is a block, they stack on top of each other, versus something that is inline. So they're all kind of in the same line of text. Okay, so I'm going to change that back to block. Okay, so you can see block, they stack on top of each other. Okay, nice. Okay, so the H's, the headings, are specific types of blocks specifically for headings. Standard best practice is to only have one H1 per page, because the idea is that search engines are going to treat that as like sort of like the heaviest thing that tells it what this page is about. That and like whatever's inside your title tag. Okay, so for search engine purposes, you may want to set that, and there's certain meta tags you can set that search engines will read in certain ways. Okay, these meta tags are just meta information. Meta information just means information that other tools will look at to determine certain things, but they're not things that are visual on the page. So in this case, a browser will look at this to kind of tell, hey, which character set I'm using. This is just some information about, just how to treat it. And this is some information about the viewport, meaning the screen itself. Okay. Again, this is automatically generated. There's a bunch of other meta tags you can use, but again, they're just there to communicate certain settings, usually to the browser or device that's viewing your page, and search engines. Okay, so other block tags are divs. Okay, divs are well, actually, let's first do the p tags. So p tags are a paragraph tag, and they're meant for like a paragraph of text. That's kind of what they represent. Okay, then you see they stack. You see that's below the h6, so it's a separate row as well. Okay, now P's and headings are really, really old school HTML tags. They've been around forever. Now, later on, you had divs, and divs just stand for division. So the idea is that they don't have a specific meaning. It's just a block. You can put whatever. So you could use a div and a p interchangeably. They really don't have any particular difference. As you can see, it's just text stacking on top of each other. It's just that signification of p, which does matter for like search engines, because search engines are trying to understand your website. So which tag you use, even if they do the exact same thing, can communicate different things. So p is going to communicate to a search engine that this is a block of text. A div is going to communicate nothing. It's just a division of your page. It's a block, a chunk of website you plan on doing something with. But it provides no context or semantics to the search engine to know sort of, hey, what this page is. So there are other tags that provide even more detailed semantics to a search engine. They're just divs. At the end of the day, like the p and the div are just blocks. Okay, which one you use functionally makes no difference. They just create a row that you can put content in. But there's also header. Okay, again, pretty much a glorified div. Okay, and here's one little difference you'll notice with the p tag. The p tag does have some default spacing or margin. That is not going to be like the other sort of like div-like blocks. Divs really, again, have like zero sort of pre-styling. While the p tag, a lot of these older HTML tags do have some element of sort of like default styling. So that's the one benefit of like a p tag over a div, is if you just want that sort of like that extra little margin by default. Oftentimes it's sometimes, I mean, if it's a block of text, if it's a paragraph, then use a p tag. But try to use a tag that semantically represents what you're doing the most. So like, if, for example, if I'm building a navigation, like the navigation bar at the top of a page, I'm probably going to do that within a header tag, and then maybe in my header tag, I'll have my h1 with the title of the page, and then a nav tag that's where I build out my navigation. But a nav is still just basically a div. Okay, so you see it's just another line of text. It's just another thing that stacks on top of each other. So again, if I were to highlight those here, see they're just rows that stack on top of each other. But the only difference is to see the div, the header, footer, they don't have any default margin. So you see here, like there's that pink space, that or that peach space, that's referred to as margin. It's the space outside of the box. Okay, every block has a margin. That's like a little cushion around the block. It has a border, the actual line of the block, and then it actually has padding, space in the box. And just to show you, let me give that p some padding, just so you can see it in action. P, we'll give it padding and border. So we'll say padding 3 pixels, and then we'll say border 3 pixels solid black. Let me get rid of this over here. So 3 pixels solid black. Okay. So you can see, now if I highlight the p tag, you can see the border. So that green block inside is the padding. So you see that little green little line that's kind of inside here? That is the padding. Then you see the border. The border is perfectly visible to that black line. And then the margin is the pink stuff. Okay? The thing to keep in mind is that by default, like if I were to set the height of the p tag, so by default, a block is only going to be as high as the content inside the block. So the more you add to the block, the higher it gets. But you can give it a fixed height. So let's say I give it a fixed height of 300 pixels. Okay, so see now it's 300 pixels. Okay, but now if I highlight it, notice that the height's not 300 pixels. Okay, you see that little number like right over there, right above the box? The height is 310. Okay, why is it 310? The reason being is that the way margin, padding, and border work by default is that they add to the height and width. Okay, so basically you're adding height and width for that border, for that padding, and for that margin. Okay, it just basically increases the height and increases the width. Okay, a thing that I will typically do, because mathematically that gets really tricky in my head, I rather think, oh, I have so much height, and then I allocate that height. What you can do is you can change the way that behaves. So there's a selector. So this asterisk means you're selecting everything. So it selects all elements. So I'm going to say, hey, everything is going to have a box sizing of border box. So now, if I highlight that p tag again, see the height is 300. Because now the border, the margin, and the padding, instead of adding to the height, they are taking from a height that I've already allocated. So they're taking part of that 300. Okay? Whichever one you prefer, but it's just understanding what's the default way that it allocates space versus like ways you can change how it allocates space. So that way you can have whichever gives you the better intuitive control over how things are spaced on your web page. Okay, cool. So that's that. Okay, but again, by default, like things like p tags and h1s have some default styling, while all the div and the semantic tags, which are header, nav, footer, these are all just basically divs. Okay, footer, aside. Aside's supposed to represent like a sidebar. Okay, there's article. I'm trying to think if I'm missing any. Oh, and there's main. Main's supposed to be like the main body of your page. Again, they're just divs, so you can use them to do whatever you want. But the idea is that if I'm a search engine and I'm trying to understand how your page is laid out, to understand how to weight the value of certain text on your page, I will use these tags to help me in understanding that. So I'll know, okay, hey, the main tag, this is the main body of content. Okay, give this a little bit higher weight. Navigation, this gives me an idea of what pages you're linking to and how people navigate your page. And again, search engines can then use that to weigh how to treat the text on your page when it comes to indexing your website on a search engine. Okay, so these have semantic meaning. Div, none of these have default styling. So all of these have no padding, no border, no margin to begin with. Okay, so again, if I highlight a div, see nothing, 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 nothing. Okay, so they have no default styling. Okay, which is why a div is always kind of like the nicest unit to separate things with, because it's like it has no pre-styling. But if the particular block you're looking to create has some sort of meaning that fits into one of these categories, you're better off using that tag because it'll be better for search engine purposes. But you could theoretically just get by and do everything with just divs. Like you can just pretty much not use anything else other than a div for every block you want, and then just style them as needed. So wait a second. If I use a div for everything, then how am I supposed to know which div I'm editing? Okay, with my CSS. Okay, well, this is where you start getting into more advanced CSS selectors. So let's say I have 3 divs. Okay. Okay, I can give it an ID as one option. So what happens is that in these opening HTML tags, I'm allowed to put what's called an attribute. An attribute is always a word that defines which attribute I'm changing, an equal sign, and then a value for that attribute. Okay, so I'm saying, hey, I'm going to define the ID attribute. There's a bunch of predefined like attributes that HTML already recognizes, but you can make up your own. So you can just say, hey, cheese equals Gouda. Okay, not really useful. It's not going to have any effect on the page. But when we get to JavaScript, you can, grab those attributes from the HTML tag using JavaScript to do custom stuff with. Okay. So I'm going to say, hey, there's an ID attribute, which is something that HTML and browsers understand and recognize. Okay, hey, I want to say the ID attribute, and we'll just call this first. Okay, so now I have a div that has an ID of first. So this is a way of me giving a unique ID to an element. No more than one element per page should ever have the same ID. There's different reasons for it, and it's just best practice. Okay, so now in CSS, instead of me saying, hey, I want to style a div, because if I say, hey, div, and I say, hey, I want to make all divs have a border of 3 pixels solid green, if I do that, what's going to happen is that all 3 divs are going to have a solid green border. So if I want to target specifically this div, okay, I can just target it based on an ID. So I just type hash, which represents ID, first. Okay, so now I'm targeting anything that has the ID of first, which should only be one thing that has a particular ID. Okay, so now I can say, hey, border 3 pixels solid pink. And see that one change to pink. Now, this then begs the question, how did it know which one to use? Because technically, that thing is still a div, so technically doesn't this rule apply? And technically doesn't this rule apply as well? So this is where you start getting to the whole idea of like what CSS is, cascading style sheets. You have a bunch of cascading rules crashing into each other. And CSS has a set of rules for determining which ones take priority, which is important because you want to know, hey, which of your rules are going to actually take place. And this has to do with something called CSS specificity. Okay, CSS specificity. Okay, what does that mean? Every rule has a certain weight to it, a score. Okay, now in VS Code, I can actually see that score by just kind of highlighting the name of the selector and just waiting. So if I just wait a second, it should pop up. And see, there it is. So you see it says selector specificity 100. Okay, think of that first number as 100 points, that second number as 10 points, and that third number as 1 point. An ID is 100 points. Okay, so for every ID included in the selector, that's 100 points. Okay, and you could have multiple IDs because you might be doing something like, hey, something with this ID that has this ID inside of it. Okay, the second number is for classes and attributes. So if I target it based on an attribute that the element has, or that class, which I'll show you in a second, and that a thing has, then it's going to get 10 points. And if I target it based on the element, so here I'm targeting it based on it being a div, so the specific element that it is, that's 1 point. So that's going to have the lowest weight. Actually, the only thing I think that might have lower weight is the all selector, which should have like 0. See, 0. Okay, so based on that score, it's going to prioritize it. Another way you can see that is here, if I click on that div, so if I click on that first div, right up here, I see like the different CSS rules. Okay, and they order them from the highest weight to the lowest weight. So you see the highest weight rule, because it shows up first, is the rules I have on the ID. Okay, so notice that it recognizes that there's also a rule on the element, but you see it's crossed out because there's another rule that takes precedence, which is this one over here. Okay, but I could toggle this off from DevTools to experiment, so I can kind of see what the effect of different things are and toggle them on and off here from my DevTools to help me figure out, hey, what's maybe causing a problem visually on my page. Okay, cool. Awesome. Now, what about this class thing I mentioned? Well, you could also, there's another property called class. Okay, and you can actually have as many classes as you want. So I could put a class just saying, hey, second, but then I could do a space and add a second class and say cheese, and I could target either one. Okay, so I could target second, so it would be with a dot, so it would be dot second, so that's me targeting a class. So you see a hash is for targeting IDs, and dot second here is for targeting a class. So if I go here and I go border 3 pixels solid red, okay, so that second one's going to turn red because, again, the div rule, this is going to get 1 point, but since this is a class, it should get 10 points. So if we highlight over there, we wait for the box to pop up, you see there the ones in the middle, that's 10 points, so that has 10 points. But I could also target, you could also make it a compound selector. So I can do something like this. Let's say I want to specifically say a div with the class of second, not just something with the class of second. Because see, this is targeting something with the class of second. It could be anything, div, h1, whatever I put that class of second on. And you can put the same class on as many things as you want. But what if I specifically want to target any div that has the class of second? Well, in that case, you attach it. Okay, so when you're saying, hey, a div with this class or a div with this ID, again, you'd write it as one thing. Okay, so it'd be like div.second. And then if I wanted to, so in this case, now if I do this, and I take a look at this, well, first let's just give it a rule, border 3 pixels solid blue. And now you see this turns blue. Because technically here you have an ID, a class, and an element. So that's 11 points. So if I highlight this, this selector has 11 points. So you see there, 10, 1. Okay, so that technically has more points than this. But again, that element has 2 classes, so I could target both classes. So I could be doing something like this. I could say div.second.cheese. Okay, which means a div that has the class of second and the class of cheese. Okay, and if I say border 3 pixels solid brown, okay, see now it's going to be brown because see this should have 21 points now. See, 2 classes, one element. Okay, because the div is in 1 element and then the 2 classes. So there's different ways if you need to get some, like the idea is like you'll have times where you find that, hey, you have multiple rules of multiple things and one's overriding another. Understanding the specificity will help you be able to create a rule that overrides what it needs to override. Okay, and you can create as many rules that lap over the same element. You just have to kind of think through like how you want to prioritize those. Okay, and I think that's a good enough foray into CSS selectors for now. Now the cool thing is, if you understand these CSS selectors, you can actually use them in Emmet. So for example, let's say I wanted to recreate this div here. Okay, with Emmet, I can type in, instead of typing in the tag, I just type in the word div, and I can say .second.cheese, and see that would be the CSS selector for a div with the class of second and the class of cheese. And if I hit enter, and see it gives me exactly that. A div with a class of second, the class of cheese, and then I can just put that text back in the middle. So using Emmet, you can write your HTML pretty quickly, give everything the appropriate IDs and classes that you want, etc. Okay. Now again, I mentioned that you could create your own custom attribute. So I can go in here and say, hey, we'll call it custom because there's no such attribute called custom, and we'll call it blah. Okay, what is this doing currently? Absolutely nothing. Okay, it doesn't hurt my page, but it doesn't help. But what I can do is I can use that for targeting CSS as well. So just to show you that, so that'll be the last thing I'll show. Okay, to target an attribute, which could be any attribute, even attributes like classes and IDs could be targeted this way. What I do is I use square brackets, and I'll type in custom, that's the name of the ID. That would be good enough. That would target anything with a custom attribute. Doesn't matter what the value is. Like what is custom, what's the value of that custom attribute? Okay. So if I do border 10 pixels solid peach, that work? No, I don't think peach is a color. Okay, another way you can do colors is you just do what's called a hex code. So it always starts with a hash, and then it's like 6 digits. So like 884455. Okay, and so that you get that purple color. Okay, and the cool thing about VS Code is that once you have that hash code, you can click on this little square here, and you can pick the color, and it'll generate the code. You could do that. Even better is you can use an RGB code. So you use this function called RGBA, and then what you do is you put 3 numbers between 0 and 255. So I could do like 100, 100, 100, and then there's a 4th number representing how opaque it is, like if it's transparent. Okay, so 1 means it's fully visible, but if I want it to be like a little invisible, I could do like 0.5 and then make it like 50% light. Okay, so that's a thing you can do. And again, I can click on here, and then I can then choose my color based on using the color picker. Okay, but as you can see, this worked. I targeted based on the attribute, and I can get specific. Let's say we had 2 things that had custom on it. So let's say I put custom on this header too. Custom equals we. But see, now both of them are being targeted. I didn't want that. I only want the div to be targeted. I could say, hey, I only want the div with the custom property targeted, and that works. But another way I can do is I can specify the value. So I can say, hey, custom, but it has to be a custom property with the value of blah. So you see now only the div is being effective because while both the div and the header have an attribute called custom, only the div has an attribute of custom with a value of blah. Okay, so again, just to give you a little foray into like targeting things with your CSS. So let's recap. Okay, these are block elements. Okay, I'm trying to think if there's any other major block elements. I think a form is another block. So if I do a form, this should be another block. Okay, this is where you would put inputs inside of. So let's just see here. Actually, let's just put form. And yeah, see, it's stacked below. The form tag is a little bit different because what it does, it allows you to put a bunch of inputs in the middle to do a form. I'm going to do a separate thing on that, so we won't go there. And then like the list. So there's two types of lists. There's a UL. Okay, and the way lists work is that when you UL stands for unordered list, and the idea is like these are like bulleted lists. So every time for each item in the list should be what's called an LI tag, which is also a block. Okay, so the UL and the LIs inside of it are also blocks. Okay, so one, although I made an L1 tag, it should be an LI tag. Okay, LI, LI 2, LI 3. Now, if I wanted to create two more LIs, instead of me typing each LI, I could use emit LI, and I can use asterisk to multiply and say, hey, give me two more LIs. So LI times 2, and see I get two more LIs. Okay, it's just ways you can generate stuff a little quicker if you get used to using emit. Okay, cool. Now, if I scroll down, you'll see, look, see, like the UL. And you can have blocks inside a block. So that's why you have to think of your page as a bunch of blocks and how they relate to each other. But if I go over here and I highlight the UL, see the UL is a block that goes below that, but all the LIs inside of it are blocks inside the block. See, they're all taking up width as well. Now, a cool thing about a block is that any block that has blocks inside of it, by default, the blocks inside the block are going to stack on top of each other because that's what blocks do. They stack on top of each other. But let's say I want those blocks to be set up as a row. Instead, there's a property called flex. So the way you do this is you target the element. So you target the block that has the blocks inside of it, the containing block. So in that case, that's the UL. So the UL has the LIs inside of it. LIs are blocks as well. So I'm going to target the UL, and I'm going to change its display property not to block or inline, but to flex. Okay, and you see now all the blocks are kind of laid out next to each other, kind of ugly because bulleted lists aren't really meant for this kind of thing. But you can see like they're still blocks, except now they're in a row. Okay, and what I can do is, the great thing about Flexbox, okay, is that they have some really nice features for how to space things out. So you have so to justify that row, how that row lines up, I can use what's called justify content, and I can say something like space around. And that's going to evenly allocate the space around those bullets. That's pretty cool. Okay, that's pretty cool. I recommend looking up a browser game called Flexbox Froggy to get better with those Flexbox elements. Like that, if you want to get good with Flexbox, try out Flexbox Froggy and Flexbox Defense, and you'll get really good at that, just how that justify content property works. But that's all it is. You just take a block of blocks and say that containing block is now flex, and it'll work. Okay, so that's a UL. A UL is an unordered list, so you see that just bullets. But there's also an OL, an ordered list. Okay, and if I were to do, let's say, 4 LIs here, so we'll say LI times 4. Okay, I go 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, you'll see here, see it's a block, and you see each one has a number. So it's an ordered list, so the idea is you're implying some sort of order to the list, and that's all fine and good. Okay, but again, there's different ways you can do this. So let's say I wanted to kind of treat it as like a grid. Like there was Flexbox that allowed me to turn everything into a row. There's another style called grid that allows me to take that containing div and treat it as a grid with a certain number of rows and columns. Okay, so I'll show you, demonstrate that real quick. So let's say I want to make that into 4 columns where it's like 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, what I can do is I can target the OL and change the display of the OL from block to grid. Okay, right now it's not going to make a change because I haven't described what the grid looks like. Okay, but what I do is I can do grid template. You can do grid template rows. That just describes how many rows there are. So I want to say there's 2 rows, 1 FR, 1 FR. So each space means another row. And what that means when I say 1 FR, 1 FR, it means each row takes up 1 fractional unit. So what you do is you add up all the fractional units. So in this case, there's 2 fractional units because there's 2 rows, each with 1 fractional unit. And then you divide up the space among that. So you say, okay, hey, if we took the entire, so rows go like this, so we take the height and divide it by 2 fractional units. Each fractional unit represents 50% of the height. Okay. Still not going to really make any change yet because we only have 1 column. So everything has to kind of be in that 1 column. So, but if I do grid template columns and I describe how many columns there's going to be, and I can say, okay, 1 FR, 1 FR. Okay, so now see I get that grid effect. Okay. So you see if I highlight the OL, so you see there's like a 4-quadrant grid. Okay, because I described it as 2 columns of equal width. 2 columns of equal width and 2 rows of equal height. Because 1 FR, 1 FR, so 100% divided by 2 is 50%. Okay, but let's say I wanted like the second column to take up 2/3. I could say, hey, the second column takes up 2 FRs, so that would split up the width by 3 and give 2/3 of it to that second column. And now if I highlight that OL, you see you get that effect. Okay, so that's the basics of how grid works. Okay, by default it's going to allocate it, right to left. Okay, you can get more specific and actually say, hey, I want specific blocks to be in specific parts of the grid by specifying grid areas in the styles for those particular blocks inside the block. But we'll leave it at this for now. So you see like, okay, flex box, when I take a containing div and turn it into a flex, okay, it just basically says, okay, all these things are going to stack in a row going forward instead of stacking on top of each other. When I say something is in a grid, it allows me to define a grid and it'll allocate those blocks along that grid. Okay, these can be really useful and really flexible when it comes to trying to allocate things and get them in the exact space that you want. Okay, so and again, ULs are for bulletless OLs. And again, this display grid and display flex property can be used on any block element that has other block elements inside of it. Okay, so then pretty much everything else is inline. Okay, so for example, if I were to do like an image tag, so this is for a picture. Okay, image. Let's go grab an image. So I'll just go to Google Images, and we'll just grab an image of some cheese. Okay, copy image address. So I'll say, hey, the source of this image is this URL here. Okay, so there it is. Okay, because the source property tells you what the image is. Well, that's a really long. Let me actually do this. That'll give me a smaller one. There we go. Okay. So see, there's the cheese. Wonderful. But if I start typing some text after it, notice it's going to end up being on the same line. Well, if I make this page bigger, you'll see, it's on the same line. So an image by default is inline. That's in line with text. You can change that, of course. You can target it and then change its display to block. Like you can take blocks and change them to inline. But again, just be aware that images are not blocks. A lot of people assume they are, and then have all sorts of layout issues. Okay. So now, continuing on, other things that are inline, the input elements that you put inside of a form are inline. Spans are inline. So if I were to do a span, we mentioned this in the previous video. The whole purpose of a span is just to be able to take a block of text that's inside of a paragraph. Actually, let me just actually do that. So if here we have like some, let's say I only wanted like this span. So let's say I just wanted this group of letters here to be treated differently than the other letters. I can give this span a class of, red letters. Actually, I want that to be one class, so red letters. Okay. So right here, notice it didn't. So if I scroll back up to that, notice it didn't like make. So and again, that's going to be this right here. Notice it didn't break that up. It didn't break up that text. But now that I have that span there, I can target it. So I can say, hey, I want to target the span that has a class of what was it, red letters? Red letters. So I want to target the span that has a class of red letters. And I'm going to say the font size. We want to make the font size a little bit bigger. So we'll say 1.2 EMs. So EMs are relative to the current font size. So what the default font size is. So 1.2 means 120% of the current font size. It's relative, which makes it great for like mobile responsiveness. Okay. And if I do that, we should see that, hey, look, just those letters, see they're a little bit bigger than the other letters. And then we'll make those colors, we'll change the color of that to red. And you'll see like just those letters are red. So span is really good for just saying, hey, I want this particular like phrase in a sentence or these particular words in a paragraph, and just say, hey, I just want to style that. I don't want to break it up into a different row. I just want to target those specific things and style it. But yeah, I think that's good enough for this video. Hopefully you guys, I make a little page, like a little bio page about yourself, start playing with a lot of this, and you'll start seeing like how you can put a lot of this into place. My name is Alex Merced. Follow me at AlexMercedCoder. Have a great day and enjoy.